Financing the Climate Market, the Missing Link. We're very proud to have with us today James Cameron, Executive Director of Climate Change Capital. I think it's fair to say that this investment bank has played a very important role not only in developing UK climate policy, but also at the European level. When we worked towards creating a momentum for having EU earmarked funds to finance the demonstration of CCS, Climate Change Capital and James' colleague Kate Hampton was extremely instrumental in doing that. So it's a great pleasure for us that we can continue this partnership, this relationship, and I'm very glad to invite James Cameron to come on the scene and talk about casino or climate capitalism. Please, James.
Thank you, Paul. I just recalled how all that happened, and it's a good example of trying to pull together public policy innovation with technology and innovations there and finance. What I'd like to do is just lay out for you the relationship between those areas to try and resolve the tension between the two parts of the title I have today, casino or climate capitalism, and find some synthesis for you so that you could leave here with some optimism that it's possible to find ways of deploying capital at scale into an economy with a much, much lower carbon footprint. And I'm going to do that with some explanation of what we do in climate change capital, because it's real and allows you to identify and form some view in your own mind of what a business with that name might do with the resources it has, because those investments do pick up a lot of the themes that I've listened to this morning, so ably presented. And it is a great pleasure to be here in this audience at this time. Many congratulations for your 25 years. It happens to fit almost exactly with my experience working in this area. I've had some of the same evolutions that you have had too. So it was Chernobyl that started me off as a young international lawyer thinking about transboundary environmental harms. It was Greenpeace who gave me my first piece of work on climate change, asking me to write an opinion on whether, think of this, whether you could take the United States of America to the International Court of Justice for failure to act on climate change in 1988. Based largely upon the evidence of one James Hansen. And many other, if I went back and looked at the first law review article I wrote in the literature about legal responsibility for climate change, the evidence that I used, the footnotes, which are required for all sorts of reasons in academic literature, they were dominated by scientific work done in the US. And they had been accumulated over a good 10 years before I read that piece. It's also interesting, at that moment, I think perhaps if I could pick November 1990 is another moment when at the Second World Climate Conference, it was possible for a leader, shall we say, on the right of the political spectrum, Margaret Thatcher, to say that the climate science was so clear, the need for international cooperation so obvious, that we shouldn't be squabbling over who pays for it. November 1990. So, I feel some of the frustration, even anger, that is present in some of your arguments today and in the history of your organisation. But like you, I found a way of channeling that frustration and anger into doing something and building the sort of relationships with those who have the resources to solve the problem. And this is an ethic, an attitude of mind that Bellona has, and it's the one that we need in order to get to grips with a highly dispersed, complex problem that requires the connections between many different types of actors with many different incentives to be made good in a variety of interests before we have a chance of resolving a very large collective action problem. So I'm going to begin with some explanation of what climate change capital does. What we've tried to do is take a very idealistic idea called creating wealth worth having. That's the philosophical orientation of my business. We're 7 years old. We've tried to take that idea and attach it to the deployment of capital at scale, although we are still young and we haven't reached scale yet, into traditional asset classes that need to be thought of in a different way, and into new asset classes which are designed exclusively to solve the problem. So we've done things like help to construct the right incentives for investment in low-carbon projects around the world through just all-out engagement in the multilateral process. The Clean Development Mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol is an example of a mechanism designed to reward the flow of capital and technology into emerging markets so that a mutual problem can be resolved together. And the relationships that go with those investments are crucial. That system has its faults, it's flawed in many ways, it's been attacked too harshly and too often by people who should be allies. The environmental leadership in the NGO world has a lot to answer for. It's wounded something that is necessary to resolve these problems without coming up with a clear alternative. And believe me, we tried, and I know that Lord Prescott is here. There was a lot of effort pre-Kyoto, and in those days I represented the Alliance of Small Island States. We did try very hard to do things like harmonise tax measures. We tried very hard to get a carbon tax in Europe back then and failed dismally. It was impossible to negotiate a harmonised tax regime in Kyoto. Never even got close. But if you could set an obligation to reduce and then offer some flexibility about how you achieve those obligations to reduce your emissions and build a market mechanism underneath it, then you could see capital flow. And it has done that. So we were the first to raise a specific fund to invest in emission reduction projects through the Clean Development Mechanism. It's the largest private sector fund. It's now fully invested. And what that means, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about the carbon market, a lot of it frustrates me enormously. And we heard from Carl some of the misperceptions that come. He wasn't dissing the carbon market when he spoke before. He was merely relaying a viewpoint which is widely held in America, that this carbon market's all smoke and mirrors and it doesn't really do anything and there might be some dodgy deals going on, a bit of fraud here, and we can't trust the Chinese. Let me tell you, this is a very heavily regulated system. It's increasingly difficult to go through that system because it's so slow. It makes it difficult to deploy capital as rapidly as we need to. But in one company in London, in our small climate change capital, together with co-investors, we have deployed over $1 billion in China alone to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Now, you find me a government that's done that, directly invested in solving the problem. And in all of those relationships, there are things to learn. In the chemicals industry, we've taken tons of carbon out of sulfuric acid businesses, out of cement, out of iron and steel, coke ovens. You use the methane from landfill sites. Waste from the agricultural sector, from the silk industry, large-scale mini hydro schemes, but large-scale wind developments in Mongolia. These relationships with a powerful new player in the global economy, in the key sector economy, they're useful, they're valuable, and they've all happened because of the price for carbon. And if there's one, I'm going to conclude with this, but if there's one thing to mention right now, if there's one thing you want to do to get the investment world that is on the whole either amoral or disinterested without an incentive, it's a price for carbon. It flows through the whole economy. It doesn't matter how you arrive at it too. It could be a tax, it could be a regulation, it could be a combination of both. But if you want to get across a border, if you want to create an incentive across a geographical border, a political border, you have to have something you can trade. You just have to. If we invest in a project in a developing world, and our return is in carbon, that's convertible into a currency that is valuable to us today without risk, a euro. Not wholly without risk. But it's a lot easier than investing in an economy with a currency that is much more volatile, or where we have to collect our return from consumers. We don't collect our return from Chinese or Indonesian or Uzbeki consumers. We collect our return from utilities in Europe who have an obligation to reduce, or in Japan, or maybe one day in California. So we created a special fund to deliver a public policy commitment as efficiently as we possibly could. And we learned an awful lot about what needs to be done in the emerging markets of the world, and that was all because we could get an international agreement to meet with a European public policy commitment that was binding in law. I could enforce it in the English courts, and that was enough to release capital which was put at risk by largely European pension funds. The bulk of our money has come from big European pension funds. Now, other things we've done are in areas that people are very familiar with, like property investments in the built environment. We all know there's a huge amount of saving that can be done through making buildings more efficient. Life does not get worse when you do that. This is not a punishment. A green building, as Peter Head will know, is actually a very nice place to live and work in. And what we've done is we created a specialist property fund to deploy capital into commercial properties in the UK. We had to limit its scope very much because that money was raised during the financial crisis at a much lower level than we would like. But we've proved through our ownership, through the attitude of ownership that we have, that you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you can reduce power costs, and you can reduce water consumption very rapidly with very simple stuff. Energy management systems wrongly calibrated in buildings, lighting systems that are utterly irrelevant for the usage they're put to in the space, ways in which you can change the behaviour and the use of the building. Now, we've managed to get anything between 25 and 40% reductions in all of those categories in 2 years of ownership of buildings that are being retrofitted. They're not being built from scratch, so they're beautiful new living organisms with the kind of skills that you've heard Michael present this morning. They're not like that, where one would hope that you could get very dramatic reductions in the usage of all those key resources. But they're retrofitting the existing buildings. They're being lifted up a ladder of performance. Now, that's improved our commercial relationships. Where the government is an occupier, we've helped them fulfill their obligations to reduce. There are now, finally, there's now a carbon pricing mechanism for buildings in the UK, so we'll get that benefit through the ownership of that stock. We've also, by working with an occupier to solve a problem, we've improved the commercial relationship that gets valued in things like the turnover of tenancy. There's less churn of tenants. They're more loyal. You can have longer leases. The commercial leases are more valuable when you work together with your occupier. In environmental technology, we've managed to deploy capital into LED lighting, into resort we like closed-loop businesses, just like you were hearing before. Those are good businesses to invest in. Energy efficiency service companies. We've put money into solar manufacturing, thin-film solar, but also into silicon waste recycling and into solar installation, and largely where the public policy incentives are very strong in places like Italy. But whether it's water or energy or finding ways to more intelligently use the resources we have today, or carbon capture and storage, where our advisory business is very heavily involved in trying to create the incentives for CCS, including, as you have heard, through the auction process, channeling revenues towards CCS. In all those areas, we think we have already proved that it's possible, in our case, deploying no more than $1.5 billion, which is a lot when you have a standing start, and nothing, but it's not very much in the scheme of things. We think we've proved the case for climate change investment. But let me finish up with a kind of warning of how hard this is and how it really shouldn't be this hard. My experience over the last 7 years of running this business as an outsider is that there are very few long-term investors. I've hardly come across any. There are one or two sovereign wealth funds that do think long-term. But even then, they're tied to the marketplace in very, very short term. Family offices, money made in some other place. Yes, I found some good long-term investors there. One for a project in Tanzania that Yara International are involved with. That's funded by eBay billions through their particular private equity structure and by Norate. Right? That's an interesting combination of money. Family office plus the kind of investment the government can make in the longer term. That works. But on the whole, there's very little long-term thinking in the institutional investor world. The incentives are not there for them to think long-term. And the system is broken up into sections that are nothing like the ecosystem that you heard from Michael. They just don't work in a way that solves systemic problems. How many times have I been to a presentation And someone said, you know, these are interesting themes, especially when I can read across to resource efficiency. If they don't like the climate change label, I can put resource efficiency up there. I can cover as many of my investments that way. Why wouldn't you want to save energy? Why wouldn't you want to save water? Why wouldn't you be more efficient use of raw materials? And many of our investments do all of that, whether it's in buildings or technology or projects or infrastructure. But the world of finance is broken up into these bits, and these bits do not make sense for collective action problem solving. They really don't. And we've got to make these industries, financial industries, which include a lot of very clever people, think a lot harder about how they combine their intellectual resources with their capital resources to deliver a different kind of economy. So let me finish up with these suggestions. I think if you did these things, you might get the short-termists, too much casino capitalism. I know it's a jargonistic phrase, it doesn't have a lot of meaning, but you know what I mean by that. To fit with the long-term capital deployment requirements, the absolute necessity to put very large amounts of capital into solving this collective action problem. If you did these things: one, mandatory disclosure. The Carbon Disclosure Project, which I was associated with for many years, is starting down this route. There's a lot of data there to understand and learn from. Mandatory disclosure would help. Two, a carbon price that covers the whole of the economy. If the European Union goes to that 30% target, you watch capital move. You watch capital move. It'll go to low carbon technologies in abundance. It will shift allocations away from high to low carbon industries. And by the way, that's perfectly appropriate. I'm absolutely fed up of competitors' arguments being made by large businesses that frankly are not going to leave the jurisdiction. They're not. They're been trying to be looked after by the public purse when they should be competed against by other technologies. If the steel industry is worried, they should be, because there are alternatives to steel in the car business, for example. So disclosure, carbon price, tax incentives for innovation. Really focus on innovation. No capital gains tax if you invest in the early stage of the innovation industry. And that includes having good IP regimes. You should team up. The clean tech world needs to team up with the pharmaceutical world, who've done a very good job of getting incentives for IP generation and retention. That's the third thing. Next, we do need institutions that are capable of deploying capital in the longer term. That's why the Green Investment Bank I've been involved in the UK is very instructive. Other places have that capacity. You pretty much do have here the capacity to make public monies match with private capital over the longer term, but you need those institutions to be in place. And finally, and I think this is something you do extremely well in Bellona, we've got to tell a positive story. We have to have a narrative which is inspiring and exciting. Because one thing I have learned about the financial services world is that despite all the brain power and all the incentives out there, there are very few leaders and a lot of followers. The system is not diverse, it's quite homogenized. They concentrate around a few assets that they feel comfortable with. And the only way they move is if they have someone to follow that inspires them, and where they can see that their basic fiduciary responsibility to their beneficiaries can be met by doing something different. And that's why we've got to work with established asset classes that they're familiar with, like infrastructure, like property, but also give them the scope to move towards something else, to reallocate that capital. My final parting shot comes from a recent piece of work done by one of the major consultants in the world. Those of you who are in the investment business will know that Mercer Consulting are a big consulting firm that advises pension funds. Now, they did a serious piece of work with a lot of people who you know very well, like Nick Stern, behind, to figure out what they should do about climate risk. And they concluded that they needed to allocate 40% of their portfolio to managing climate risk. We're nowhere near that today. But we should be challenged to think about how, working with the industry, because they're going to have to figure it out on their own terms, with government incentives, with good stories told about the possibilities, that we can actually do that and move 40% of the capital in those institutions that hold the font of money for the capitalist system into a different direction that's more in line with the themes that you've been arguing for over the last 20